This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by BioEquity Europe. BioEquity is Europe's premier international showcase for financial dealmakers and biopharma executives to meet rising biotechs.
Welcome to the second season of the BioCentury Show. I am Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief of BioCentury, and it is really a pleasure to kick off 2023 in JP Morgan Week with Kiran Reddy, Senior Managing Director in the Blackstone Life Science Group. Kiran, I said it's a pleasure. It's certainly a pleasure to talk to you. But I have to say, I've been here at JP Morgan for maybe less than 24 hours. Not a lot of pleasure out there, okay?
I totally agree with that sentiment. Simone, pleasure, to be here with you, privileged to be with you to kick off 2023, but agree, no fun trudging through the rain.
Right, so even beyond the rain, I'm from England, so I don't care about a little bit of rain. There's certainly cloudy sentiment. Last year was pretty lousy, and that might be an understatement. I'm hearing a really fair amount of trepidation. Let me just ask you your top level view, what you're thinking about, what you're expecting in 2023.
Sure. Now, you've got to certainly contextualize where we have been, where we are going, with regard to 2023, and I think you have to recognize how stark 2022 was in contrast to 2021. We had, a 2021 with, bull market, the life sciences industry saved the world with COVID vaccines. We had, a macro environment that was fairly stable with regard to inflation and interest rates. That really flipped dramatically in 2022, and it was like a light switch. The music stopped. We had much more significant issues with regard to geopolitics. The macro factors had a large play with regard to interest rates, inflation. And that all cycled, with regard to effects on biotech, biopharma, where more, companies had significant valuation declines and, well talked about. We saw 40+% declines in the XBI. We saw many biotech companies, trading below cash, having less than 12 months of cash, in the 20-30% range. And that, all of that, created this certainly dour, sentiment related to biotech and biopharma that was, again, such a stark contrast to 2021. In many ways, there was a deer in headlight, what do we do? What are these management teams doing? What are the boards going to do? Is this really going to last? And how do we make decisions, in this significant period of volatility? What I see in 2023 is more of okay, we've been able to breathe and digest what has happened, in 2022, and recognize that we've been here before, that this industry has had periods of times where the macro economy, has not performed well, and that has had ramifications on the biopharma universe. We've dealt with that fine. Innovation continues to be quite strong. It's not that the fundamentals of our industry are broken in any way. We've just had to now deal with, now with some more capital constraints and issues. And I see 2023 as a digesting of 2022. Not that everything is going to be all rosy, but at least, there's more of an appreciation of, okay, now we got to go back to a different playbook, a playbook that we've had in the past in 2007 and 2008.
So I want to follow up on this. So macro is macro, right? We understand that, we can't stop people invading other countries and so on. But let's have a little bit of navel gazing and talking about catalysts when we talk about catalysts. So there have been, a huge number of companies founded. Many people think maybe too many companies. There's also been a lot of reward in public markets for very scant data. I mean, I can't remember if it's 3-4 years ago, CRISPR companies on preclinical publications, right, would suddenly have multiple, changes in the public equities and their valuations. Then, of course, it sort of, with the drought, even in early 2022, companies weren't being rewarded for catalysts, by which I mean readouts in clinical trials, things that were considered catalysts. I'm not talking about the publications anymore. So more recently, we started to see that change. Now, how are you looking at that in terms of companies? As I said, we can't do anything about the micro, but the macro, sorry. But what companies can do themselves, what can and should they be doing differently now as we come out of this era? Are we going to be more discriminating in looking at phase 2 or pivotal studies, and will the markets be more discriminating in how they reward them?
Well, we've absolutely already seen what you've described, what you just highlighted, a more discriminating a public market with regard to clinical data sets. That 2022 was very much a hot or cold. If you did not deliver phase 2 data sets, and this was not phase 1B data sets, it was phase 2 placebo-controlled data sets where in fact you beat expectations, not that you showed statistically significant efficacy, but that you demonstrated that your drug was in fact more effective than standard of care, that was well beyond what would have been otherwise expected in the performance. Those were the situations where you were getting rewarded with public company valuation increases. And if you were delivering almost on expectations or below expectations, but you still had a positive clinical data set and there is a real drug possibly here, those companies were punished, in the public markets, and there are a couple of good examples of both. You've got the Prometheus of the world, where there's data they delivered in ulcerative colitis and Crohn's that looked very robust and superior in the refractory patient population, and that were rewarded very nicely in the public markets as a function of that clinical data. Then you had other companies like Gossamer that also delivered, clinical efficacy data, yet did not meet expectations and were punished, as a function of that in the public markets. Yet, both of these companies may have, in fact, commercially successful drugs, but there is no nuance, in this market. That's the current reality of where we are.
So I want to follow up on this idea of nuance, and you've talked about hot or cold. Companies right now, what I'm hearing is they're really going to have to deliver solid data to get rewarded, and they need to build their plans maybe to the next readout or whatever would be that milestone. Do you think that there is room for gray? Is the step up going to be less than in the past when they are rewarded by the public markets? Or do you feel that sort of valuations for good companies will be as robust as ever?
Hard to predict. I guess if I just reflect on 2022, I would expect behaviors to be pretty similar to 2022, where there is capital that wants to be deployed into these public biotech companies. We've seen pretty significant shift from our public equities colleagues that were doing crossover rounds, and now almost entirely are focused in private companies and are now entirely focused on those public companies. They're looking for those safer haven companies that have really strong clinical data sets and are likely M&A targets because they have such strong clinical data sets, and pharma has a real demand for new products. that would then support that, in fact, they should get good valuation uplifts as a function of having really high quality data sets. I believe that's what we saw in 22. I would expect to see the same in 2023.
And just staying with this for one more minute, are there, in the idea of rewarding good data, are there specific therapeutic areas that you are hopeful that we're going to see some kind of step change in? Where are you looking at?
Well, as the audience appreciates and you appreciate, I mean, oncology is always the elephant in the room, the 50, roughly half of our market, and there it almost is. You've got to parse out, well, what are you talking about in oncology? Is it cell therapy? Are you looking at bispecifics? Or do you think that, is it immunotherapy? Specifically, there, I guess I would say that we've been, very impressed with the clinical data sets coming from cell therapy. There is a lot of activity in that space, and you could argue there's a pretty significant amount of redundancy, perhaps with the number of companies pursuing similar targets, similar approaches. Yet you would expect that to continue to deliver, profound benefits for patients, and hopefully we work through the manufacturing requirements to make these commercially viable products. So that would be my comment in oncology. Very interested in how the bispecifics emerge as well. How do they compare in clinical efficacy to some of the cell therapy products in oncology? As that certainly could be another major uplift and major trend in oncology. Outside of oncology, say we've continued to see the tremendous progress in immunology. There would expect more, that we are perhaps even we'll see some movement in cell therapy towards immunology. That would be incredibly exciting. More projects like we saw the Nimbus acquisition from Takeda. Clearly, there's a lot of demand for very high quality molecules in inflammation and immunology. Those would clearly those are the two obvious areas. If you're asking like where are the non-obvious areas where we've largely forgotten them, or we've told ourselves, well, we should never invest in these areas. There's a couple of those that are kind of coming on the radar screen, surprisingly. Obesity, which was one of those never invest areas for many years, and we've seen just remarkable data from companies like Novo Nordisk and Lilly. I would expect that there'll be some resurgence of energy in thinking about how we can develop better drugs for obesity that could be certainly your mega blockbusters. The other area that was of never invest or be very careful to not invest would be neurodegeneration and Alzheimer's disease, and there, while controversial, some clinical data sets from lecanemab and Eisai and Biogen, I'd say look interesting. Look like our first real large placebo-controlled phase 3 data sets that are showing some clinical benefit, and those are perhaps reasons to believe that perhaps these areas that have been out of favor may have some hope for becoming back in favor.
Well, we're going to take a brief break, and when I come back, I'm going to ask you about a couple more maybe graveyard areas of drug development, and then we'll talk about issues like the Inflation Reduction Act and maybe some M&A questions for you. And I look forward to joining you back again in 1 minute.
The 23rd Bioequity Europe Conference heads to Dublin, Ireland in May 2023 with a program focused on how to create a new playbook for biotech success in Europe. In 2022, over 800 industry leaders from 30 countries joined Bioequity in Milan, Italy for 2+ days of strategic panels, one-to-one partnering meetings, and C-level networking. More than 150 biotechs selected by BioCentury presented their story to investors and potential partners. Don't wait, 2 of the last 3 in-person bioequity conferences sold out. Register today and join BioCentury EBD in our Dublin Regional Host Committee at the industry's premier C-suite and investor conference. Visit bioequityeurope.com for more information.
Well, back at the BioCentury show with Kiran Reddy. Kiran, we talked about some of the therapeutic areas. Another couple of so-called graveyard areas that seem to be showing some new life are NASH and COPD. Anything making you believe that those results are sort of inflection points rather than a blip? I know with obesity, there's generally a feeling that that field might take off now, that there's some fundamental biology that has really been unlocked and there's a lot of opportunity. I'm wondering if NASH and COPD are similar, or you'd put them in a different category.
I would say that that NASH, I am still waiting to become a convert. That I'd say certainly the biomarker data that companies like Madrigal and others have generated are quite encouraging and are getting closer to the demands that we've seen from the FDA and from regulatory bodies more broadly. Ultimately, we need the connection between biomarkers and hard clinical endpoints. Those are coming. There's some early evidence of effects on cirrhosis in the high-risk patient population, but that's, I think, the key question, and the opportunity sets are really in the broader lower risk population. Which patients need to be treated, and do they really have hard clinical benefits in fact treating the NASH in these patients? That to me is still to be determined as to whether this is really an area that will grow significantly or not. With regard to COPD, no question that is a real disease and that affecting millions of patients, and we've had suboptimal treatments for those patients. Struggled with what are the mechanisms that allow us to approach that disorder beyond some of the acute mechanisms that we have, or based steroidal mechanisms. But there are some intriguing data sets around immune pathways, IL-33 and other mechanisms of perhaps mitigating mucus secretion. I would say I'm more optimistic about COPD and seeing some real new approaches to COPD for patients.
All right, and last one on therapeutic areas before we turn to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, so I started out, Kiran, in dopamine receptors. That's what my PhD is in, and my heart is there. And one of the graveyards, we talk a lot about neuro, but really neuropsych has been really underinvested, and there's no question that it's still a massive, massive need. Karuna did have some very good data in schizophrenia. What do you think it's going to take to see investors re-engage with, schizophrenia, other mental health illnesses?
An area that I have invested in, that I've worked on, and know how significant that unmet need is, whether it be schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, anxiety. No one is developing medicines for anxiety. That we still have 20-30 million Americans with generalized anxiety disorder. Real issues. How do we get there in terms of approaching them from a clinical development perspective? That I think we are still trying to scientifically work through.
Is it the endpoints? Is that a big part of it? Fundamentally, biology?
Yes. Yeah, it fundamentally is about the variability, in these endpoints, where for active drugs, for drugs that we've approved, they've required multiple trials for one trial to demonstrate, that clinical efficacy. And it's a combination of many factors, Simone. It is the endpoints, but it's also, the variability, the variance that we see in those endpoints, the heterogeneity likely, in the patient populations that we're studying. We're going to need to see innovation, on those endpoints, but also likely on, can we do a better job with diagnosing and getting more precision medicine into psychiatry? And that requires real patient segmentation, which to date, we don't have those. There's hope and aspirations around, can we use imaging to help with patient segmentation and endophenotyping of anxiety disorders or bipolar disorders, or electrophysiology and EEG to perhaps help. But to date, they're still very much in their discovery development stages.
Yeah, so I am hearing about sort of precision medicine for schizophrenia and so on, and it does sound to me that there also is scope here for regulatory innovation and for partnering, to find better ways to innovate in these areas and produce more meaningful endpoints that maybe that investors can then believe in. So talking about projecting and investments, we cannot talk about biotech without talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. I think we all know that. So how are you thinking about the IRA and the implications that it's going to have for biotechs and investing?
Another factor that kind of jolted the industry in 2022, amongst all the other ones that I mentioned. And I'd say, similarly to what I said about other elements of, capital constraint issues, a lot of 2022 was about digesting, what does this mean, for our industry? Well, how should we react, to this, if at all, in terms of how we prioritize our investments, or if you're a biotech company or a pharma company, your pipelines. There's a few things that, after multiple conversations with colleagues of mine, either investors or operators and biotech and pharma colleagues, that are, I believe, things we're working through, which are, it's clear there are right now incentive differences for small molecules versus biologics, with regard to periods of exclusivity and when price negotiations would ensue. 9 years versus 13 years for biologics. So that clear advantage to biologics, that will likely result in some element of reprioritization of projects in biologics. To some degree, we've kind of almost seen it without the Inflation Reduction Act, where if you look at the data from last year, we saw equal numbers of approvals in biologics to small molecules. So some of that, is happening, in our industry organically, but we've then put this, now the Inflation Reduction Act may further, in fact, compound that. The other element that's clear is when you have these more limited periods of times for exclusivity, it requires what before you could do, in series, now may need to be done in parallel with regard to clinical development. The Humiras of the world that could get one approval, the next approval, and the next approval, and not have to worry that price negotiations wouldn't ensue, after a certain number of years, that's going to be increasingly challenging and unlikely in this current rubric, where you're going to have to, if you want the full value of your asset, you probably will have to run multiple clinical trials to, in parallel, to make sure you've got that period of exclusivity. That adds more risk, to these projects. Before, we could de-risk them with serial approvals. Now we'll need to see, more creativity. Perhaps, this is where more partnerships will ensue, more creative financings will ensue. We do a lot of at Blackstone financing of of clinical stage assets, often ones that have multiple indications where we can fund some of those assets via royalty structures. Perhaps more of these types of structures will be required in this setting.
So you actually mentioned one thing, and there were a couple of implicit assumptions that many people have. You referred to one of them. So one of them is that the price that's going to get set by Medicare or negotiated, however, whichever word you want to use, that is going to be effectively the equivalent to genericization and loss of exclusivity.
Sure.
The other one is that an implicit assumption is that commercial payers in the US are just going to adopt the Medicare price. So where are you on both of those issues, or each of those issues?
So I certainly a fair point to make, and I would say some of the assumptions that are going around and are being discussed are in fact the true the downside scenarios. The truth will hopefully be somewhere in between the current situation and those downside scenarios. I honestly I don't think I can predict where that's going to truly play out, what kind of pricing discounting will occur once negotiations ensue, and will commercial players adopt and force innovators to adopt that pricing. I would say unknown, but these are the things that we're closely monitoring, and once some of those things become more clear, we'll see more shakeout, perhaps even still, in how the prioritization of various pipelines are, and even how some of the valuations of biotech companies are reflected.
So I want to ask a couple of questions about commercialization. One of them still from the IRA, which is, do you think, like, for pharma companies, it might change the calculus about whether they first launch outside of the US, maybe in Europe? And do you feel like there's any strategic differences that are going to fall out in commercialization plans as a result of the IRA?
I think it's clear to us that still, regardless of the IRA, which is a Medicare focused pricing regulation, the US still is the lion's share of the commercial opportunity in the market and the value of new medicines. Therefore, I don't see that dramatically shifting the prioritization of the US marketplace and the regulatory focus of the US to the rest of the world. Not to say, I think it perhaps brings things close, perhaps for some markets, namely the Medicare markets, that might become more not certainly not equal, but we may see some shifting towards rest of world versus the US. But by and large, it's still US is where the value for our biopharmaceutical assets continue to reside.
So staying on this topic of commercialization, we're seeing independent biotechs more and more, at least wanting, whether they're successful or not is a different issue, but at least wanting to commercialize products themselves. We also hear about it, where like everybody wants co-commercialization deals or so on. What are your thoughts? Do you think there's space for more companies to be commercializing products themselves and growing in that area?
Well, the data are not great for biotech companies successfully launching drugs, and there are always exceptions to the rule. But a recent LEK report showed biotech companies, I think 60 to 70% of them underperform dramatically with regard to their launches, and that's something that that's the aggregate data. I think there's always nuance to where, in what types of markets can biotech companies, successfully commercialize. We have we have portfolio companies of ours that in rare indications have rare disease indications with limited commercial infrastructure, have been able to do very well launching medicines. But there are clearly other, situations where that's going to be much more complex and partnerships make a lot more sense. And I always view it as the biotech company, needs to put forward the credible threat of being able to, launch and commercialize the drug, as they are, potentially, M&A targets, for biopharmaceutical companies or larger, biopharmaceutical companies. But what we've seen, certainly in 2022, which would expect to see more of in 2023, are biotech companies that have commercial assets are the ideal targets for M&A for pharma, with the current administration and the difficulties in doing mega mergers. You really do need to look at these smaller biotech late stage and commercial opportunities, as these likely M&A targets. That's how I see a lot of what's going to happen in 2023. And while I think there are examples of cases where biotech companies can successfully commercialize, and that's wonderful, it's probably the exception, not the rule.
I'm going to end with one last question on data and disruption, but stay with commercialization. So companies are starting to embed data science throughout their business, and I would argue that our industry has really lagged on this compared with other sectors. I don't think that's actually very controversial. Now, one area which seems to me to not have changed is commercialization models. It's still got very analog, very traditional methods. Do you see data or technology solutions able to disrupt commercialization models anytime soon?
Simone, I think there's some areas where in fact it already has. I mean, and some of that is, you look at a company like Biohaven when they commercialized their CGRP franchise, relative to pharma and to competing against AbbVie. They in fact used some of these approaches, social media based approaches, more targeted campaigns, using next generation technologies to commercialize, tech enabled approaches to commercialize and compete fairly successfully, with a large pharma company. That's perhaps perhaps better targeting, a better patient identification of who needs these medicines. Yes, I see that continuing to mature and coming to practice. It does require that enough of us are in these infrastructures, whether it be the Facebooks of the world or the various other social media platforms.
When you mean us, you mean patients?
Meaning the patients.
People, patients.
Yes, yes. Because if the patients are not there, then you can't target them in with these novel approaches. You have to target them with the traditional approaches of pharma representatives going to clinics and educating doctors. And some of that is changing. It's clearly most evident in the rare disease populations, where they become large drivers of the development of these medicines. And
right.
As such, you can take a very different approach to commercializing those medicines. If we see that more happening for common diseases like diabetes and obesity and heart disease, perhaps some of these novel models for commercialization could have real impact.
It doesn't sound like you're expecting it that soon, anytime soon. Thank you. This was a great conversation. Always good to talk to you, Kiran. Hope to get you back on the show and in other forums of BioCenturies quite soon. And meanwhile, I wish you a very good 2023. Hopefully it will beat expectations. Let's put it like that. Let's hope it beats expectations.
That's a great way of putting it, Simone. My pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by BioEquity Europe, BioEquity is Europe's premier international showcase for financial dealmakers and biopharma executives to meet rising biotechs.